Hello, one and all. Yeah, Jimmy Dore and Cornel West had a little spat, shall we say. But what's interesting is if you put it in the context of what happened with Jimmy Dore and Marianne Williamson and Jimmy Dore and RFK Jr., it starts to make sense. Let's talk. Hello, I'm having trouble here with my banners. I do not know why I can't get my banner to show. Doggone it. Having a time here. I got a banner. So what I'm trying to do is put a banner. I have this banner that goes across the bottom of my screen, and it says, I don't know what the hell's going on here. Okay, let me give it a shot. That's not important now. I'm always playing, I'm always at war with StreamYard. Not, I love StreamYard, but I mean, I'm at war with it in that I can't figure it out. It ain't StreamYard, it's me, right? It's not you, it's me, as people say in relationships. All right. Let's talk. Let me make sure before I go any further that I got sound and everything's fine. I think that okay, and my input is good. All looks well. Okay, I got to check these things. I've done entire videos and not had any sound. All right, so I would be willing to bet that there are a lot of my international friends will look at this video and say, "Oh, it's not about Ukraine or BRICS or anything like that." And I'm not. I don't want to watch this one, but they should. They should, because it is important. So Jimmy Dore had Cornel West on. Again, a guy that I've said I like, I like Cornel West. I think he's a nice person and I think he means well. Not a bad guy at all. And Jimmy was very frustrated because Jimmy brought up some various things, things to do with lockdowns and COVID and vaccine mandates, and Cornel West kind of brushed them aside and made it pretty clear that, hey, man, we don't agree on this, right? He brought up some other issues that seemed obvious to him. And he was very frustrated and angry, not angry at Cornel West, I think. He was just angry because he felt like it was obvious to me. Jimmy was kind of looking like, man, these things are obvious, dude. You don't get it. And the language that Cornel West was using. And I kind of sat there and watched that. But then I went back and I watched Jimmy's discussions with Marianne Williamson, Jimmy's discussion with RFK Jr. If you just watch Jimmy's discussion with Cornel West, that's one thing. But why not? You watch him with all three and you see a pattern. You see Jimmy talking to these people saying, look, there are certain things that are very, very obvious. I've covered them. Anybody should be able to look into this situation and see this or that. And I'm very frustrated because you can't see it. Let's talk about why. Let's start with Cornel West. One of the things that seemed to frustrate Jimmy about Cornel West was Cornel West's language, the language that he was using, right? And as Jimmy brought up, he basically said, you kind of sound like the Antony Blinkens and the Biden people, et cetera, because there's certain words, certain terms, certain phrases they use, right? So the one is continuous use of the words white supremacy, continuous use of the words, continuous the LGBTQ trans stuff, the certain things that are buzzwords, certain words that are used frequently by the neoliberals, by the neoliberal warmongers in particular, the worst people on earth. Now, let's separate something before we go any further. Let's separate language from reality. Okay, Tony Blinken et al. Will put up a sign that says "I'm for." They'll put up a multicolored flag on a U.S. embassy, right? That U.S. embassy will be loaded with CIA spooks. It'll be pumping weapons to murder people all over the place and overthrow governments. So in reality, it will be one of the most evil spots on earth that's oppressing people, that's murdering people of color more often than not in countries, right? But what they will do is they will use this, oh, we're for the LGBTQ trans community, or we're for Black Lives Matter, or blah, 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 or we oppose white supremacy. That is a head fake. That is political cover. That is to pretend that I'm the good guy. That is to argue that I'm for all these things, these human rights. How about that? I'm for human rights. All these kinds of things they use in their language to cover the devious and evil deeds that they're doing. And unfortunately, a lot of people get confused. Even a lot of people in good meaning, they're like, oh, white supremacy. They're using that, or whatever the case may be, right? And they talk about these things as though Blinken and these people, as though Biden and the neoliberals really are having a discussion about these things. When in fact, they're not having a discussion about these things. They're just using it for cover. In fact, they're using the LGBTQ people, the trans people, the Black people, etc., as human shields, one could argue, and say they're just using this rhetoric to pretend to be doing good so they can cover the terrible, evil things that they're doing. Okay. But why does Cornel West use this language? Cornel West uses this language, right? But he's not for, if you listen to him, the truth is, I mean, let's be honest about Cornel West. If you listen to this guy, if you look at his history, you are what your history says you are. He's not a guy that wants imperial overthrow in the governments, mistreating people, etc. He means well. Whether he does well or not, that's, you can argue that, but he means well. If you look at his history, he really means for Palestinians and people all over the world, etc., to get a fair shot. So Jimmy, in hearing Cornel, heard the language, as did we all, of the neoliberals. And the neoliberals use it. It's a false and fake language. Now, here's what's important to understand. Jimmy's point was valid. His point was valid about how the importance of language. A lot of people know me. They know, Paul Robeson Jr. was my mentor for years, and that's something he talked about all the time. Language, language, language. Language is important and critical. It's critical how you communicate to people, the terms you use, the phrases you use, how they connect to what you're saying, right? Why they believe you. Jimmy Dore understands intuitively that when you use the language of this violent, oppressive, imperialist, colonialist, murderous group, that people will associate you with them. When you use the language of Tony Blinken and Joe Biden, people will hear the language of Tony Blinken and Joe Biden, and they will associate you with them. Regardless of what your intent are, that's what people are going to do. That's the reality. If in fact somebody walks up to you and starts speaking Chinese, you're going to associate them with China. You're going to think, well, maybe they're Chinese, maybe they've been to China, maybe they worked in China, maybe they had something to do, but you will associate them with China because they're speaking Chinese. If somebody's speaking whatever, you know what I mean? If they're speaking Russian, you'll associate them with Russia. You're going to say, where did you learn Russia? How did whatever, right? So when Jimmy Dore hears Cornel West saying using the language that the Bidens and the Blinkens use, he intuitively knows, and he basically says to Cornel, look, man, if you use their language, people, everyday schmucks like me and Garland, will tend to associate with these people, and you won't have success. I think what he was telling Cornel West didn't get, we'll talk about why. What he was telling Cornel West is, look, I think I like you, Cornel. Like me, I like you, Cornel. You're a good guy, man. You got a good heart. We hear you talk about the Palestinians. We hear you say, when we see the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese, that we can't see bad, evil people. We have to see our precious brothers, right? That's good stuff. That's good stuff for a man to say, when we see the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and the Venezuelans and blah, 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 we must see our precious brothers. That's the way I see them. It's great. But what Jimmy was trying to get across to him was, look, use the language of an oppressive group. people are going to associate you with that. But why did he use the language? And why did Jimmy hear? Jimmy speaks the language that I speak, right? Jimmy's father was apparently a police officer. They grew up, he had a bunch of kids. They didn't have much, right? They didn't have a lot. He grew up probably, working poor. A cop back then didn't make a lot. And if they had a bunch of kids, it was tough. Working poor. I talk about class, middle class, working class, working poor, right? As you go down. I speak Jimmy's language because I grew up when I was a kid, when I was little, extremely poor. And then as I moved into my teenage years, we did much, much better to the point where I was, probably no problems about it. My mom had a bus company. She was making far more than most people were, So I understand the concept. I grew up learning the language of the extreme poverty. My dad was a longshoreman, right? Long story, my parents weren't together when I was born. My dad ended up later years marrying my mom, come together. He was a longshoreman, so he made a decent salary. My mom started a bus company. It worked out real good. She made very well, right? So I understand from poverty, extreme abject poverty. I know what it's like to be extremely poor, and I understand the language that you use and the worldview that you have when you're extremely poor. And I understand the language of the middle class and the upper class. I understand those languages because I've traveled throughout those groups, right? And I understand the frustration of hearing that upper crust language and understanding that working people ain't going to bite that hook, right? And that's what Jimmy was trying to get to Cornel West. But why does Cornel West use that language? Where did Cornel West go to school? Yale. Where else? Harvard, Princeton, right? When you see these people, the Jake Sullivans and these people on the people on Wall Street, when we see these people, right? We see monsters. We see neoliberal thieves and bastards. That's what we see when we see these people, right? When Cornel West sees them, he sees his classmates. He sees his classmates. He sees his alumni from the same college that he does. He speaks their language, and he doesn't speak a different language. You see, he's not just a member of academia, and I'm not saying this to denigrate Cornel West. As I said, I like him. He's using the language of let's just say the language of the oppressor. And I don't mean oppressor of Black people. I mean oppressor of the world, right? The neoliberals. But if you lived in China all your life, you're going to speak damn Chinese. If you lived in Russia all your life, you're going to speak Russian. And if you went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton, you taught at Harvard, you're going to speak Harvardese. And Jake Sullivan and Blinken and all these other people, Rhodes Scholars, you name it, right? These people speak a particular language with particular words. I would argue that Cornel West is in fact genuine when he says he wants whatever groups, people of color, LGBTQ, whatever, when he says he wants everybody to be treated fairly. I would argue that Cornel West is like me. He does. He doesn't want anybody to be treated better or worse. Cornel West wants a world where everybody, this is the way I put it, every human being has the same expectation of rights. Me, I don't have to go name them because that's not the language I speak. I can say I want every human being to have the same expectation of rights. In Harvard, the language that you use is that somebody says, Cornel West language hasn't changed in 30 years. It's not his fault that the Democrats co-opted that same language. Man, we have some brilliant people. Iceman Vamp. Let me show that. That's brilliant. Let's talk off of that. Iceman, got to tell you, bro, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's not Wim Hof, is it the real Iceman? Exactly his point. Cornel West has been saying this stuff for the last 30 years. Why? Because he meant it. He wants everybody. Look at his position with the Palestinians. He couldn't get tenure at Harvard because his position with the Palestinians was, hey, they're not getting a fair shot. And he didn't get tenure at Harvard. He had to leave. Just think tenure at Harvard, the value of that. Very important. But he had to leave because he wasn't willing to compromise his belief that the Palestinians weren't getting a fair shot. That's who he is. He's a good guy. I'm going to defend him as a human being because I think he's a good guy. So he was willing to take the hit and sacrifice. But as Iceman Vamp said, The neoliberals they looked and they were like, people are saying that other people are being treated fair, that the little guy ain't getting fair. We'll take that. We'll co-opt that. Then we'll pretend that we're standing for the little guy and human rights. And then we'll utilize that to oppress the whole damn world. It's like, imagine a world where people, a nation where people were so gentle and kind that they never had any animosity towards anyone. And then imagine us attacking that world, that country, and stealing everything they had because they'd never see it coming because they'd be nice people. That's the way the neocons think, right? So they co-opted. He's walking around saying the stuff that he said. I agree or not, whatever. He said it out of from his heart. But the neocons took it and twisted it into we're the good guys when they ain't. But being a guy who's from the same place, he lived in the same, stayed in the same circles as them, he has the same worldview in some ways. One of the contradictions, so it comes from his background. It comes from the fact that he's a Harvard and Yale and Princeton guy, and Jimmy and I ain't. If you listen to me, people always say, well, Garland, you're speaking a very simple way that's easy to understand, because that's how I grew up. I grew up around poor people. Even when I wasn't poor anymore, I still had a lot of friends that were poor people. And that's the language of poor people. The language of poor people, we don't have to use a lot of 50-cent words. The language of the working class and the middle class is we just need to understand each other. And so when a lot of my friends, white, black, and what have you, they weren't highly educated people. And it was only important that you understood what the person said, not that you use some 10-syllable word to impress everybody. Right? And Jimmy's similar, and I'm similar. We just say what we got to say, and we're easy to understand because we're not using fancy words. We avoid that, Listen to Cornel West, man. Cornel West, again, he speaks like a poet, right? And it sounds beautiful and poetic, but at times it's a little philosophical and deep. And at times, if you listen to Cornel West, you got to have a PhD to kind of grasp what he's really saying as he references and makes these literary allusions to, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or whatever the hell, Herman Melville's Moby Dick or one of these other things. Then in academia, it's self-evident. It is axiomatic. It is, you know what I mean? Here we go to axiomatic. It is basically obvious. Everybody knows. Everybody's read Melville and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Of course, when I make an allusion to that, everybody in my circles will understand that, right? If you listen to Cornel West, some of the discussions that he has, you got to be in academic circles to really grasp the depth of it. They can be deep and really, really enjoyable, but you got to be from those academic circles, or at least have that level of education in order to understand it. So that's what it was. That's for starters. He's not willing. No, let me change this. Jimmy Dore was saying, look, the language you're using, man, you're going to scare the living bloody octopus crap out, whatever that is. You're going to scare the octopus crap out of the working class and the working poor and the poor. And it frustrated Cornel West, because he was like, look, what's wrong with that? This is what I say. This is what I believe in. It's the only language. You're asking a man who only speaks Chinese to speak Russian. It ain't happening. And you're going to get frustrated because you're using the wrong language, the language of the oppressor and the neocons and the imperialist, whatever term you want to use for these neocons. And he's going to get frustrated because he doesn't have another language to use. He doesn't have another option. That'll like be asking me to speak Cornel Westian, which probably I kind of maybe could, but he couldn't speak this. Maybe I couldn't. I don't know. Now, let's go on. The other thing that I brought up, and I think it is important, is if you look at this simply like, hey, he clashed with Cornel West, that's one thing. But let's take it deeper. This is what nobody else is talking about. Didn't he clash with Marianne Williamson? Jimmy Dore had Marianne Williamson on. That didn't go so well. Had RFK Jr. on. That didn't go so well. Why is that he brought these three people that were running as outsiders, and every time it didn't go well? Because one of the issues going on here is that the U.S. empire is being exposed by its own contradictions. There are some massive contradictions here. And to expose those contradictions puts you outside of the acceptable range of discussion, outside of the Overton window, right? Let's talk about one of the contradictions. And Cornel West kind of gets into this a bit, but he's not quite there. And that is people like me, and maybe you, who look at the US government, who look at the EU, who look at these governments and say they don't mean us any good. Not they mean us okay and good in some things, not they're looking out for the public good in some things and other things they're not. No, they're not looking out for the public good. They're not looking out for the public welfare. They're up to no good. They're just here to extract money from us, whether it's student loans, whether it's, medical, Medicare, stuff like that, NHS. They're there to use any tool they can to rob us blind. We are nothing but hosts for these parasites, right? That's what I see. That's what a lot of people see. That's why when it got to, and this is going to make sense. I'm going to get to Cornel. It's going to make sense in a minute. When COVID came, there were a certain group of people that were willing to listen to everything they were told and say, we trust them and believe them, right? There was people that were like, when the government said, hey, you got to be scared because COVID's going to get you. Therefore, do this. Walk around in a circle and flap your arms. And there were people like, okay, the government's told us, we got to listen to them. And they start flapping their arms and walk around the circle. And then the government says, stand on one foot. Yes, I'm standing on one foot. Okay, here's an orange. Eat one orange. Okay. If the government told them to do something, they do it. Why? Why? Why is that? Because unlike Garland, when the government gave them instructions of what to do during COVID, they believed that in that particular instance, the government was looking out for the public welfare. They believed that during the COVID crisis, the government was trying to help them get through it, do the right thing, make the world a better place, et cetera, right? People like Garland, as soon as this started, people like us, COVID started. And there were those of us who said that, and the government said, flap your arms. And there were those of us who said, we don't trust you sons of bitches. You're always up to no good. Why? Why should we flap our arms? We ain't saying we ain't going to flap our arms. Give us some scientific background and research that says this is how flapping your arms will help. And the government said, shut up. You're off of Facebook and Twitter. You're out of here. We're shutting you down. You're hesitant to do what we tell you to do. And we got even more suspicious and said, just as I thought, you bastards are up to no good. And when they said mandates, there were those of us who questioned that, said, wait a minute, before we get the mandates, we have to have a discussion about what we're being mandated to take. And we want the background, and we are suspicious. We're suspicious over that we can't sue. We're suspicious over this or that, right? This is not a position on those things. This is to say there were those of us who inherently believed that the government of the U.S. empire and its vassals, Canada, Australia, the EU, are up to no good, that they prey on us like parasites, and that they're not looking out for the public good ever under any circumstances. That ain't what neoliberalism does. Neoliberalism is only there to make a profit. And if neoliberalism can make a profit by hitting you over the damn head with a sledgehammer, it will beat you mercilessly with that sledgehammer. It ain't looking out for you. So what you had was people like us who had a foundational belief that the U.S. empire and its leaders are not looking out for our good, our public welfare, ever. So when they told us to do stuff, we questioned it. And the more we questioned it, the more they tried to shut us down. The more we questioned it, the less information we got. Hey, can we have the information on Pfizer? Sure, in 66 years, not a problem. Can we sue? No, you don't need to sue. Who needs to sue? There's too many lawsuits. What kind of country is this? Not so many laws. And the more we saw, the more suspicious that we got. Now, let me change this. It confirmed what we already believed. So those of us who already believed that this government under no circumstances looked out and stood out for our best interests when COVID happened, that didn't change. And that made us more suspicious. And the more suspicious we were, the more we looked into it, the harder we got beaten down by the government, the less we believed, if it was possible, that they were looking out for our good. Now, when Jimmy Dore starts talking to Cornel West about mandates, right? when he starts talking to Jimmy Dore about lockdowns and things like that, he's looking at it from the perspective of, I don't trust these bastards. They're up to no good. They are never here to do the right thing for us. Cornel West, no, 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 no. I don't agree with you on that. Why? Because what Cornel West was saying, without saying it, is when it came to COVID, I agree with the mandates. The government's position was everybody should do this particular thing because it's in the best interest of society. What Cornel West is saying, without saying it, is I do believe that in this instance, the government was acting in the best interest of society. When it comes to lockdowns, right? The government said we're doing it in the best interest of society. What Cornel West is saying is, I believe that the government was acting in the best interest of society for the general welfare. That's what you're saying when you say I support mandates. The government says you better everybody better do what I tell you, whatever you're mandated to do. And if somebody says I'm with that, then it actually means they believe the government's doing it for the right reason. So the clash there, in a way, was not necessarily about mandates or the jab or anything like that. It was Jimmy Dore from a perspective of, I never believe these bastards are doing things for the right reasons. They're doing it to make money, to prey on us. They're not going to take the necessary precautions to make sure these things that they're telling us to do don't harm us. I don't trust them. And Cornel West was saying, yeah, well, I do. I do think that in this instance, they're working on our behalf. So we should go along with the mandates. We should go along with the lockdowns. When the government tells us to do this, they're saying that we should do it. And it's because they have our best interest in mind. That was the clash, really. It was a clash of people who never believed that the U.S. empire, the Biden administration, the U.S. government ever has our best interest in mind, versus Cornel West, who comes from academia, who comes from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, who can, in fact, look at, the Tony Fauci's of the world, look at the people with all of these acronyms behind their names and say, well, these are Harvard and Yale and Princeton people, a lot of them who are telling us to do these things. MIT, which is, a block away from Harvard, same thing, 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. And they can, because they've grown up with these people. When I say grown up, I don't mean from a child. I mean grown up from an education perspective. They can believe that these people are acting in our best interest, and Jimmy and I can't. And that was the clash there. And there's no way to get around that. There's no way that you can resolve that. As we say in Zen, the tiger and the shark will never fight because they have no common ground. You can't. Cornel West and Garland Nixon and Jimmy Dore sit in a room, and Cornel West says, I think the government was acting in our best interest in this particular instance. Therefore, we should do what they say. And we can't agree. And Garland and Jimmy are going to say, I never think they're acting in their best interest. So when they tell me something, I'm skeptical of it. I'm going to look into it. And the more I find it don't look good. I think the difference is Cornel West didn't need to dig into it like we did, because he already had the trust. Those of us who dug into it found a lot of really scary things that made us even more skeptical. Jimmy, whereas Cornel West didn't need to dig into it. He had no reason to dig into it because he trusted it, that it was working for us. And it was good, and they were doing the right thing. Now, so the two things we got with Cornel West and Jimmy Dore arise from our background, right? What produced us. And with Cornel, he came out of Harvard. I'm not downing him. I'm not saying I don't even like him, but he came out of Harvard and Princeton. He speaks their language. You listen to him, and you listen to the neoliberals. White supremacy. Well, here's a contradiction that if I'm Jimmy, if I'm introducing, if I'm speaking with Cornel, I'm going to introduce this contradiction. And he didn't get into it much because he was very frustrated. I saw that. And the contradiction is Biden and the neoliberals saying we oppose white supremacy at the same time. See, to me, I'm about contradictions. If I'm interviewing all of those people, any of them, RFK, Marianne Williamson, and Cornel West, I'm going to introduce these contradictions. I'm going to have a discussion about the contradictions. That exposes things. Two things don't match. They don't make sense, right? So I'm going to introduce an obvious contradiction, and that is you don't like white supremacy, and Trump, from your perspective, is a white supremacy. Now, remember also the discussion of Trump. If you're in Harvard or Yale or whatever, Trump is the devil incarnate. You talk about Trump, right? If you're a working class person like Jimmy or Garland or whatever, what do you talk about? You talk about the dynamics that created an environment where Trump would rise to power, right? Trump is not the focus of your ire. The circumstances that created an environment where Donald Trump seems like a better option than what they're offering, the system is offering, is where the discussion needs to be had. If you are part of the Harvard, Yale, Princeton diaspora, Donald Trump is Hitler. He's Napoleon. Actually, I think they kind of like Napoleon. He's they romanticize. What's interesting is, in a lot of ways, Napoleon was Hitler, but they romanticize Napoleon. Not so much Hitler yet, but at any rate, but the contradiction you have to bring up, I'm getting at, is this. You say you hate Trump, he's a white supremacist, blah, blah, blah. Biden is a better offer, blah, blah, blah. But the contradiction is this. Joe Biden is arming murderous Nazis in Ukraine, real Nazis, not kind of half-assed Nazis, the real deal, proud Nazis. So the contradiction is Joe Biden said that one of the reasons that he ran for president was because Charlottesville, he saw Nazis and they were chanting "Jews will not replace us," and that freaked him out, and therefore he had to run for president to oppose white supremacy. But there's a contradiction here, because as president, he's sending all of our money over to a bunch of white supremacists. Well, excuse me, he's sending it to the military-industrial complex. But what he's doing is he's arming white supremacists. And as you look at what happened in Ukraine, you come to find out that the white supremacists, the Ukrainian Nazis, were not the largest part political power brokers, the most prevalent political power brokers in Ukraine until after the U.S. overthrew the government. After the U.S. overthrew the government, and Joe Biden was in charge of that country as the governor, you might as well say. Then the Biden people empowered the neo-Nazis, inculcated them into the Ukrainian military, and brought them to prominence and power in Ukraine. So there's a contradiction to say, I oppose Trump because he's a white supremacist and I oppose white supremacy. Joe Biden is better. But right now, Trump says, and this is not what he's saying, I'm going to rephrase it, I want to stop sending money to the white supremacists. I want to stop this war supporting the white supremacists. Now, that's not what Trump's saying, but effectively, that's what's going on. And Biden is saying, no, 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 whatever we do, we can't stop giving money and arms to the white supremacists and Nazis. There's a contradiction there, isn't it? And to me, I would have to address, if I'm interviewing him, I got to make that contradiction obvious to him, right? I got to make that a contradiction obvious and say, look, I understand what you're saying. How do we come to grips with the fact that Joe Biden is, in fact, arming Nazis and white supremacists? And you say you oppose Nazis and white supremacists, but you will support this guy over the other guy. One guy wants to arm him, one guy doesn't. So there's a contradiction that should be introduced to Cornel West, a very important contradiction. The same contradiction needed to be introduced to Marianne Williamson when Jimmy Dore talked to Marianne Williamson. That contradiction, she's very pro the Ukraine stuff. That has to be introduced. RFK Jr. The whole Palestinian issues. There's a simple question to me again. Do you believe that every human being should have the same expectation of rights? Well, who's going to say no to that? I don't think RFK Jr. would say no. And then I got to ask him, well, in in Israel, in the occupied territories, if you are an Israeli, if you're an Israeli Jew, you have certain rights. If you get arrested, they've got to, they got to charge you with something. You've got, you've got a right to attorney. There's a lot of rights that you have in the government. If you're Palestinian, any Palestinian, not a Palestinian accused of a crime, just any Palestinian, they can pick you up off the street and they can do what they call administrative detention. What does that mean? That means a life sentence, basically, if they choose. They can pick you up, they can take you to jail, not charge you with anything, not tell you you were ever charged with anything, nothing. They can just take you back and put you in a cell and leave you there until they feel like letting you go, right? Do the Palestinians have the same rights as the Jewish Israeli citizens? Absolutely not. So that is a contradiction that needed to be introduced to RFK Jr. Well, RFK Jr., if you believe that all human beings should have the same expectation of rights, which clearly you do, how do you navigate the Israeli situation when the Palestinian, and I could go one after the other things where they don't have the same rights? Right? These are contradictions that need to be introduced. But understand something, RFK Jr., he ain't come from working class. He came from very, very wealthy and powerful people. And those are the circles that he runs in, right? And he speaks the language of the circles. And the people that he runs it, people are like, oh, he's paid off, he's this or that. If you want the truth, I think RFK Jr. really believes the stuff that he said about the Palestinians. In his circles, that's what people believe. That's what people say. That's what you have to believe, right? If you're in particular groups, there's certain things you can't possibly believe for whatever reason, right? So it doesn't work with your worldview, with your view of the universe. So RFK Jr., when it came to the Palestinian issue, in his economic, social, cultural, educational class, the people that he associates with have to believe certain things about Israel. The Israelis are good and the Palestinians are just a bunch of terrorists and they're trying to protect themselves. Those are the things they have to believe. And Jimmy ran into that and he got angry and frustrated. And it's an anger and frustration that is valid. It's why don't you see this? It's so friggin' obvious. But he can't because he's blinded by the context of his life. Let me say this about RFK Jr., Marianne Williamson, and Cornel West. Put them all together in a bunch. The contradictions that Jimmy Dore exposed inadvertently had to happen. They were inevitable. They were a good thing. Don't get upset about it. Don't get mad about it. They had to happen because these are three people who are running for start here. Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. are running in the system. They're not even really running. They're not running as outsiders. I'll put it like this. Let's use two words: reform, revolution. The revolutionary wants massive change. The person who wants a revolution wants bottom-up change. They want dramatic change, right? Revolution, revolve. Whatever's at the bottom comes to the top, right? So a revolutionary change wants to change the system. Says the revolutionary change, systemic. We don't have to use the word revolutionary. That may freak some people out. It doesn't matter what language you use. Systemic change, right? Jimmy, Garland, look at this and say this system's rotten to the core and it's predatory. Right? Systemic change. We don't trust the system. We don't like the system. We believe the system is out here to rape, rob, kill, do every terrible thing we can imagine. So we want systemic change. The reformer, actually, believe it or not, wants to save and preserve the system. They want to reform the system that we have. They believe that it's corrigible, that it's salvageable. So the reformer says, look, you let me go into this system. There are different levels of reform. Then there's the fake reformer. Hillary Clinton was the fake reformer. Hillary Clinton would run and they would say, yeah, the system's great. They just need a different system manager. You're a little unhappy with the system right now. You let me manage the system. I'll manage it differently and the system will work. The system's fine. The system's great. We got a wonderful system. Don't listen to these people they're telling you we need systemic change. You bring me in, I'll tweak it, and then it'll work better. They are the fake reformers. The next reformer says, look, system ain't all that bad. You listen to RFK Jr. He's a reform candidate. He's not a revolutionary candidate. He's not a systemic change candidate. He'll get in there and say, look, the free market is the best. Well, there are a lot of people who believe in the free market, right? I'm not a free market fundamentalist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't, but before you even have the discussion about free market, you have the free market, you got to have a discussion whether a free market exists. And it don't. This is a market that is manipulated by the oligarchs, right? This is a market, a metaphorical market. And realistically, it's a self-serving scam. It's a self-serving racket for the super powerful. So RFK Jr. basically says, look, I'm a free market, blah, 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 right? But what we need to do is stop bringing all of this. We need to bring our troops home. We need to close our bases. We need to stop being an empire. Well, there are those that would argue that the neoliberal market, you could argue that we have, is runs parallel to empire and bases and all that. As Paul Krugman said, you can't have McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas, right? He made it clear that from the perspective of the ruling elite, using kinetic power, using war to oppress people around the world is what allows us to maintain this system. Using oppression is what allows us to maintain the system. So is it possible for RFK Jr.'s version of reform to work? There are those of us that are doubtful when we say systemic change. You know what I mean? Systemic change. You got a engine that's, in really, really bad shape. It's pouring Marvel mystery oil or some kind of a potion, some kind of a chemical in there that's going to clean the a carbon off the inside of your engine. Is that going to fix it? Well, if your engine's in really, really bad shape, no, it's not. Do you want to reform your engine, or do you need a new damn engine? Do you need to rebuild the engine? We believe we need to rebuild. People like us are like, we need to dramatic change. The people that we have in there and the methods that they're using and the perspective that they're taking is going to only enrich the oligarchs and hurt us. So you're talking about a reform candidate. And I'm not downing or denigrating RFK Jr. There are things I like about him. There's things I don't like. But the problem is this: the system is not going to tolerate RFK Jr. even trying to reform it. Ain't going to tolerate that. So he's saying the system needs to be reformed. I'm a reformer. He had to clash with Jimmy Dore and people like me who are saying this: we need systemic change. Marianne Williamson, same thing. She's a reformer, just a different level reformer. She's like, oh, what we're doing in Ukraine. See, first of all, if you listen to Marianne Williamson, in the same way that I said when it came to the issue of COVID and mandates and things like that, Cornel West believes in that instance, the government's doing the right thing. They're trying to help us. They're acting for the general welfare, right? And there are those of us who are like, no, they never do that. Get out of here with that. Marianne Williamson, when she says, oh, we've got to stop Putin, and now she's using the language of the Tony Blinken, she's using the language of the neocons. It's a similar thing, because what Marianne Williamson is saying is this: look, yes, granted, did these bastards lie us into war after war? Sure. Did they go around the world doing terrible things, overthrowing governments in Libya and Iran and on all around the world, doing all of these things all forever and ever and ever? Yes, yes, yes. But I believe in this instance, they've got a good heart. In the instance of Ukraine, they're doing the right thing for the right reasons. Putin must be stopped. Now, if you say Putin must be stopped by whom? Putin must be stopped implies that he's doing something evil, and the people that are stopping him are the good guys doing it for the right thing. So Marianne Williamson, as would as is Cornel West and the issue of mandates and the COVID mandates and all of that. He implies the government's doing the right thing in that instance. She implies, well, the neocons and the government are doing the right thing in the instance of Ukraine, acknowledging they've done terrible things in the past, but in the instance of Ukraine, now they're doing the right thing. The system is salvageable, it's corrigible. Sometimes the Biden administration and the neocons, sometimes they do the right things for the right reason, and other times they do bad things. We've got to acknowledge that. No. That's where we disappear. Now, keep in mind something. She's very, very wealthy. Cornel West comes from Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Marianne Williamson, look at her background. She was the Oprah Winfrey show, and she's the goody guru to all of these billionaires and powerful people and all this kinds of stuff. In the elite circles, she'd walk in the room and they'd all, oh, it's Marianne Williamson, right? And I used to say she's a prettier version of Joe Biden in a lot of ways when it comes to foreign policy. She's Biden light. She's a light version of Biden, where she says things far, far nicer, but she buys into the belief that these neocons are acting in Ukraine for the betterment of the world, that they really got to stop an evil guy named Putin. Well, I'll put it like this. That does not align with their history. That does not align with what they've done. And furthermore, let me add this, and this is important. Just like I said, when it came to the COVID stuff, the COVID policies, a guy like Cornel West wouldn't have to dig into all this stuff like you and I would, because he trusts him. So why bother? If you start digging into it, you're going to find so much stuff that's problematic. It's going to make you even more skeptical. Marianne Williamson, if you start talking to her about Ukraine and start throwing things out, well, what about the Minsk Accords and this and that? She looks at you like she has three eyes. Why? Because she has a certain level of trust that the government's trying to do the right thing. So she doesn't have the impetus. She doesn't have the reason. She doesn't have the drive, the motivation to start digging into this Ukraine thing. Well, there's some weird contradictions here. There's issues here. If, in fact, the U.S. is now acting on behalf of the world for sovereignty and independence, then why the hell is the United States at this very time occupying illegally 1/3 of Syria? It happens to be the third where their wheat fields and their oil fields and all of that. If we're standing for democracy and independence, at the exact same time, we're illegally occupying 1/3 of a country in the Middle East, where all these people around the world are saying you can't occupy that country. That's an illegal occupation. But yet we're against an illegal occupation in Ukraine, according to that. Again, a contradiction. Now, I would have said, let's work on this, Marianne Williamson. There's a contradiction here. How can you believe this when this is going on? Let's set these things side by side. Let's talk about Syria. Do you think that the United States government should be occupying the Syrian oil fields when the Syrian government, when everyone around in the region says you need to leave their Syrian oil fields and give them their government back? And if she says, I don't think we should, then I'd say, why? Why is it? Is that, do you think the UN has a right to come in? Should there be sanctions against the US? Should not the world step in and say, what you're doing is illegal, what you're doing is unethical and immoral? See, what I would do if I'm talking to Marianne Williamson, I would have a robust discussion about what's going on in Syria. And after that robust discussion about what the illegal occupation of Syria, I would take that. I would then go into the 2019 RAND report, in which they talked about how they wanted to destabilize Russia. And I would do a little bit on that. Well, isn't it interesting that in 2019, the US government said they wanted to destabilize Russia? And look right here, they talk about Ukraine, arming Ukraine. They want to send arms to blah, blah, blah. Wait a minute, what are they doing now? Do you think there's a connection, Marianne Williamson, between the government saying in Zbigniew Brzezinski's book in 1998, him saying, yeah, we could use Ukraine to screw over Russia. In 2019, the government saying we can use Ukraine to screw over Russia, and now they're trying to use Ukraine to screw over Russia. And do you think these things are connected? We're doing this in Russia. We're doing this in Taiwan. Let's connect Russia and Taiwan. We're doing the exact same thing on the border of two other superpowers. Do you think those things are connected, Marianne? If I did it, I would bring up contradictions. I'd bring up things that you can't run from. But I understand what Jimmy's doing, because Jimmy, I'm a geopolitical analyst. That's what I do. international. I do foreign policy, international conflict, things like that. And Jimmy Dore is a guy who's really, really good at what he does. He's a comedian. He's a voice for people who are angry. He's funny. And he covers as much stuff as he can, very broad stuff, but he's not as intricately detailed. And a lot of the things that he covers, I don't know much about. But that's my area of special expertise and my specialty, right? If someone said, so I would bring up these issues and point out the contradictions and have Marianne Williamson and have RFK Jr. and have Cornel West, where there's a pocket between the contradictions. The US is saying this, but they're doing this. You're in the middle saying it's okay. How can you believe that if the US is doing one thing and our government is doing one thing and have a history of doing one thing, how can you believe they're doing the right thing now? Those things don't add up. It comes across as naive or ignorant. Now, I wouldn't use those terms because they're confrontational, but that's the way it comes. It comes across. We are doing things right now, this very minute, that demonstrate that we don't believe what we're seeing in Ukraine. So you have to dig deep. You have to find contradictions. But as I said, Marianne Williamson, hanging out with Oprah, hanging out with the rich people, writing books for them, meeting, doing forums for wealthy people, hanging out with the ruling elite. And she speaks the language of the ruling elite, and she has the concepts of the ruling elite, and she wants to reform the system. Yes, let's keep doing what we're doing as far as Ukraine. Let's keep doing that. The system is, when it comes to foreign policy, the system's good. And she'll talk, oh, Iran, they're doing this, blah, blah, blah. So she wants to reform the neocon system. She wants to put a smiley face on it, which they're doing, and she wants to make it light. She wants to lighten off of it a little bit, right? She wants to turn the volume down a little bit on foreign policy, but not systemically change foreign policy in another direction, right? RFK Jr., he wants to do a systemic change when it comes to foreign policy, but when it comes to the economic policy, he feels, hey, this free market, he accepts the existence of a free market. And even libertarians now are saying this ain't no free market. Those of us who were far to the left have been saying this is a joke if you think this is a free market. Look at the GameStop thing. Free market, and when the GameStop issue, when a bunch of average schmucks figured out how the wealthy people game the market, and they gamed it the same way, the market shut down illegally. The market went in and turned off GameStop. Sorry, you guys can't keep doing that. You're making a fortune. But that's what they do every day. When average person figured out the system changed, because the system is not designed for the average person to make money. It's a self-serving racket, right? It's a Ponzi scheme. So RFK Jr. is basically saying, I can reform, I can completely make systemic change on foreign policy. Great. He's saying, I want systemic change on some corporate policy, right? Which, whether it's Monsanto or Big Pharma, systemic change. Important, critical. Great. But when it comes to the area of economic policy, and some in foreign policy, Israel, that's a whole other subject to talk about. But when it comes to economic policy, he's saying, I'm kind of on board with these people, and I think we can tweak, reform our economic policy, and it'll still work. And there are those of us who say it's a self-serving racket. The only thing it does is it extracts money, it's parasitical, extracts money from the working class, the working poor and the poor, and gives it to the oligarchs. And that's not a system that can be reformed. It has to be systemically changed. I'm not saying how. You can say we want socialism. You can say we want pure, a libertarian government, hands off of everything, whatever, right? You can say whatever you want, but most of us say we want systemic economic change, because what we have now is nothing but a racket, and it's cleaning our clocks. So what you look at is three various reformers, and Jimmy Dore doesn't want reform. And a lot of us don't have any confidence that we can reform a system that has this level of corruption. And the last thing I'll talk about is Trump. The last discussion is, if you were in academia, Trump is, the He's Satan, he's Hitler, right? And you have to focus on Trump. If you're in academia, then January 6th was Pearl Harbor. It was the, academics or the neoliberal or the liberals, Pearl Harbor. Oh my God, it's the worst thing that ever happened. The rest of us look at it as, look, people are unhappy, and in the same way that a lot of us see Trump as and the Trump phenomenon as there were a lot of voters who said, look, I want a bull in a china shop. I don't care who I vote for, as long as that person comes in the White House and they got an axe in their hand and they start swinging that axe and hit everything, break everything, crush, smash, Hulk smash. That's what a lot of people wanted. And they just saw Trump as something that the system really didn't want, didn't like. And so they said, look, I hate this system. Trump may not be the answer or whatever the case, but he's going to come in there and start bashing this thing up. And man, is he going to piss off the ruling elite class. Hooray. So there's a lot of people that supported Trump because they had some hope that maybe in something different, he's an anti-politician, but also they hated the system so bad that they would get, all they wanted was somebody to walk into the door with a system and start swinging an axe. And they believed that Trump would do that. And in his first term, he really didn't do that, right? He didn't do that at all. I don't think he was capable of doing that. I don't think he understood what he got himself into. And then what we also saw with Trump, we saw the system basically try to take Trump out. And we look at it right now and we say, system's trying to take Trump out. And you better be wary when you support the system trying to take out a politician, because the tools that the system uses to take out Trump are the same tools that the system will use to try to take out Garland Nixon and Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal and anybody that goes out and protests. That's what Jimmy was saying. Be wary of the tools that they're using to take out their adversaries and their enemies. Their espionage act, they went after Assange. They went after the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party. They went after Trump. They're using it, right? So we're like, hey, they got another tool, man. RICO. They're using that to go after Trump. They're using that to go after these protesters who are protesting against the police, right? People who are doing what they have a constitutionally protected right to do. Like it or not, agree with it or not, if you believe in the constitutional protections, which we don't have, then you got to say, okay, they're doing what they have a right to do. Get off of their friggin' backs and let them do it. Get out of the way. We believe in people's rights, First Amendment, things of that nature. I don't care if you're protesting against something that I agree with or don't agree with. Go ahead, and you got a right to protest, and I would fight for that right to protest. And there are a lot of people who believe that it's a matter of a principle. They're going after with RICO charges. So Jimmy Dore was trying to say, be careful of the tools that they use. Now, because of Trump, they hate Trump so bad, they're going to use every tool in their tool chest, every arrow in their quiver to go after him. And then they're going to use the same thing to go after us. And he was saying, and they'll use it to go after you. Because in Cornel West's world, because in his culture, the culture of Harvard, the culture of Yale and Princeton, Trump is the evil of all evils. You make exceptions. Doesn't matter what they do as long as they get Trump, because Trump is the most hateful thing ever. And January 6th was 9/11 mixed with it was 9/11 mixed with Pearl Harbor. So therefore, since it's the worst thing ever, the government needs to do everything they can to stop it. But that implies something else I was talking about too. If you believe that the government should go after Trump because he should be held accountable, if you believe that the government should go after the January 6th protesters because they should be held accountable, don't you also have to believe that the government's doing it for the right reasons? Don't you also have to believe that the government is concerned that January 6th was an assault on our democracy, which you got to believe we have a democracy, which I don't, that the government is concerned that more people will threaten our democracy, and they got to think we have democracy, and that the government is doing it for the right reasons? You have to have some faith that the government is acting for the right reasons. If you do not believe that the government acts for the right reasons, that the neoliberal government, if you don't believe they act for the right reasons, then you cannot believe that they're going after the January 6th protesters or going after Trump for the right reasons. That doesn't work. You have to believe that there's some level of good in the government, some level of righteousness. The FBI is going after Trump, the Department of Justice. Now, what I would have brought up was the crimes of the Department of Justice. I would have brought up the the DOJ, some of the things going on, what they did in election interference, and I would bring up an obvious contradiction. You're saying Trump tried to overthrow the government. Trump tried to interfere with the rights of the voters, et cetera, et cetera. And that the Department of Justice doesn't want someone to interfere with the rights of the voters or interfere with the election. Therefore, they're acting in good faith. They're good faith actors. They're going after Trump because they don't want him or anyone else interfering with the rights of voters. That's what they literally charged him with, right? Okay. Then I would bring this up. The years 2019, the December, the years 2019, a guy from Delaware, a computer shop, calls the FBI and says, I got Hunter Biden's laptop. They act uninterested. He has to keep calling them. Finally, they come get it. It's Hunter Biden's laptop. They get it. They keep it for roughly a year. Keep it for a long time, many, many months. Let's say 8 months, 6 to 8 months. Just before the election, and they've got Hunter Biden's laptop, and we've seen all the incriminating evidence on this. Just before the election, the FBI goes to Twitter, social media, and the news and says, look, the Russians may come out with some story that there's a Hunter Biden laptop and that it has incriminating evidence on the Bidens. But if they do that, it's Russian propaganda, and you need to censor it, and we'd be happy to help you censor it. That's what the FBI tells Twitter, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But they knew it was a lie because they had a laptop. They knew that it wasn't Russian propaganda. So the Department of Justice, FBI, lied intentionally just before the election in a way that benefited Joe Biden, one of the people that was running. Over the course between 2016 and 2020, a whistleblower, a guy who was one of the principals of the Burisma gas company, came to the FBI. You can go online and you can read the 1023, the FBI form, and told the FBI everything about Joe Biden and Burisma, and in fact said to the FBI, look, my boy here, my guy, has actual recordings of Hunter Biden, recordings of Joe Biden. He talked to him on the phone. He's got the dirt on him. You might want to get those, right? Biden was up to no good. We gave Biden, forced us to, on Burisma, we didn't want to hire Hunter Biden, but Joe Biden forced us to do it. Extortion. And then we had to pay $5 million each, bribery, on and on and on. So this guy, you could go online and read the FBI's 1023, look it up on Hunter Biden. The FBI had all the information they needed. They had the laptop to corroborate the claims, and they had a Burisma principal making the claims. Did they investigate it? Nope. Did they look into it at all? Nope. What did they do? They went to social media to ensure that this stuff was censored. They hid it. They hid it from Congress. They hid it from you and me. They hid it from everywhere. So we now know beyond a reasonable doubt, to a moral certainty, that the Department of Justice deliberately, with malice and a forethought, interfered in the 2020 election by hiding information that would have been detrimental to one of the candidates, namely Joe Biden. That brings a question up. If you introduce that reality, then you have to say to Cornel West, Cornel, that being the case, are we to believe that the Department of Justice willfully, malevolently, maliciously, with a forethought, interfered with the 2020 election, interfered with the rights of voters to vote and to be informed and knowledgeable? But now they have suddenly decided that Donald Trump is doing the right thing, wrong thing, that Donald Trump did what we know they did. They're accusing him of doing what we know that they did. They're accusing him of doing it, but they're doing it because they're standing for democracy. Before the election, They work to thwart democracy. The evidence is clear. And what you're believing is they work to thwart the democracy before the election, and after the election, they're working to make democracy better. You see what I'm saying? But these are the kinds of contradictions that need to be introduced to these people. You have to lay it out like that. And I know that Jimmy was he was very, very angry and frustrated because he was talking to reformers and he wants systemic and revolutionary change. And you had people who are simply saying we need to reform this system in one way or another. He's a guy who's like me and probably you, says, I don't trust these people as far as I can throw them. They're up to no good every time. And he was talking to various candidates who were saying, well, yeah, they're up to no good in this particular area, but in this area over here, they're doing the right thing, which is inconsistent. He was talking to people in some instances, such as a Cornel West, who comes from an academic background, who comes from an academic cultural background, who sees Donald Trump not the system and the dynamics that created Donald Trump as a politician. You cannot grow certain plants without a certain temperature. Palm trees will not grow in Maine. The dirt isn't right. The temperature isn't right. Everything's not right for them. They'll grow in Florida, right? Trump could not become president if the environment, political, economic, social, and cultural environment weren't just right for him to become president. So if he becomes president, you can focus on Donald Trump, or you can focus on the environment that created an opening for Donald Trump to be president. And you can ask yourself, if I want this person to be president, what kind of environment do we need for that person to be president? But that's a different discussion than Donald Trump is evil and he must be stopped. And I trust that the government, that the Department of Justice, the people that killed Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and on and on and on, I trust that they're going to do the right thing. Well, those things are inconsistent. At any rate, thanks a lot, everybody. I got to run. I'm out of time. But that's something I wanted to talk about, and I think it's important. If you get a chance, as you know, I'm thrown off Twitter again. I'm working on addressing that. But so share this on Twitter, share this on all your social media platforms. If you can, make sure you subscribe. We've hit 60,000 subscribers on YouTube. How awesome is that? But also make sure you go over to my Rockfin channel, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. Become a member. It doesn't cost anything. If they heave me off YouTube, guess what? Boom, you can still go there and get the info. Also, get my info. Also, if you can, there is an option. It's an option on Rockfin. Rockfin doesn't do advertisements and all that stuff. What they do allow is subscribers. If you can afford it, become a subscriber on my Rockfin channel. You don't have to, but you can if you can afford it. Rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. It's like $14.99 a month, and if you sign up for a year, they give you a couple months free. That's an option if you can afford it, to help the Rockfin channel and to help keep Rockfin going. I appreciate it. Of course, patreon.com is there. PayPal is an option. Buy me a coffee is an option. All those kind of things. Hopefully within the next month, I'll have this little corner of my office. I will have this turned into a studio, thanks to the money that I'm getting from you all. You're paying for this, so I really appreciate this. I'm working on that. And I guess that's about it. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Sorry, I got to go to work, so I can't answer the super chats. I love the super chats. We get some great questions and comments. Maybe I'll start doing like Alexander McCurris and those guys over at the Duran, one of my favorite channels. And I will start doing a separate video where I talk about super chats. Share this everywhere. Thanks a lot. I'm out.